My name is Ross Maher. I'm a resident of North Providence District 55, and I am the constituent of Representative Corvasi that asked him to sponsor this resolution. And I'm here to advocate in favor of 5188, a resolution for Rhode Island to join the call for a convention of states in accordance with Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution. I'm going to apologize. I'm going to repeat some of the things that were already said, not only for my benefit, but for yours as well, because I kind of talked to these things.
Sure, we made you wait for a while, so
that's okay.
Apologize.
I'd like to put some emphasis that this is not a red, blue, Democrat, Republican partisan issue. From my view, this is a responsible civic issue that all citizens should be engaged on. Article 5 provides two similar yet different methods for proposing amendments to the U.S. Constitution, those being the Constitutional Convention initiated by 2/3 of the U.S. Congress, and conversely to that is the Convention of States initiated by 2/3 of the states, or 34 states, as was already said. Regardless of the mode of proposals, the proposed amendments still require ratification by 3/4 or 38 states. And unfortunately, this is really the point where these two modes of convention oftentimes are used incorrectly and interchangeably, which they are not. This is generally where the misunderstandings, the confusion, and ultimately the fear of a convention of states takes root. As stated, to date, there are 19 states that have successfully passed the same resolution as H.R. 5188 through both chambers of their respective legislatures, using nearly the exact same verbiage and speak to the exact same three topics in 5188. And those topics are, as was already stated, to impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, to limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and to impose term limits on federal officials. I just want to deviate from my script for just a moment to say that though these may seem vague, I would suggest to you that if you're going to have a conversation about something, you need to have a starting point. And these topics are sufficiently vague to get us to that starting point. That doesn't mean that that is what is exactly going to come out of a convention of states. In this legislative season, just want to stay on topic here. In this legislative season, this same resolution has also been introduced in 17 other state legislatures besides Rhode Island. The verbiage and the topics of these resolutions are the same, and this serves a critical point for this committee and this legislature to understand. Why? Because a passed resolution is legally binding, and the verbiage itself limits the scope and the authority of a commissioner sent forward to the convention to the three topics that are authorized by H.R. 5188. And with that said, I'd like to address three of the more common arguments that opponents use against the Convention of States. So one of the more common ones that I more recently had seen is that a Convention of States will cause constitutional chaos. So my question to that is, how so? It's very loosely defined. And I ask, how do any of the three topics of this resolution cause chaos? How does exercising a clear provision of the Constitution cause constitutional chaos? What is chaotic about fiscal restraint? What is chaotic about term limits? And what is chaotic about limiting federal overreach? To me, a statement like a convention of states will cause constitutional chaos is a statement that is long on whining and short on analysis, based in fear, and to suggest that it's better to sit by and do nothing. This is not a constitutional convention with an open agenda to introduce any subject that someone wants. Again, this is why it's so important that you understand the differences of a convention of states coupled to the limited scope that is authorized. The resolutions passed and pending all cite the same three topics. What you see in them is as important as what you do not see in them. And this is any effort to somehow remove or modify an existing amendment. Further, to attempt to introduce additional topics into the convention would go beyond the scope of the resolutions passed by all the states, and thus result in a referral for a recall back to the home state. And I'll revisit this subject in just a moment. The second thing that I commonly find is that somehow this will reshape our Constitution. In my opinion, this is a misstatement of fact. Will a convention of states reshape our Constitution? It might, but only to the degree that the states allow. First, by passing the resolution to call the convention in the first place. Second, by limiting the scope of the commissioners. And third, the ratification process, which again requires 3/4 of 38 states to ratify. Simple math, and I hope we can all do that. Simple math shows that if a bad amendment somehow makes it out of the convention, it only requires 13 states to kill that amendment versus the 38 states that it takes to ratify. So tell me, which of the 38 states required to ratify and approve an amendment that they did not send a commissioner forward to represent on or to propose in the first place? And actually, it requires both houses of a legislature to ratify. So what you're really talking about is a minimum of 76 legislative bodies across this country to agree on the same 3 topics. Can you imagine 76 legislative bodies voting in favor of a bad proposed amendment or somehow curtailing an existing constitutional amendment? Personally, I cannot. So to address the issue of restraining the commissioners sent forward, prior to us coming in, I had made 15 copies, one for each of you. Inside of this is what's called a faithful delegate resolution. I provided 2 copies to the clerk because I was told that I couldn't provide them directly to you. Be that as it may, states can also implement a faithful delegate resolution which codifies constraints upon the commissioners to which stipulate that they can be recalled, they can be charged with a felony, they can have fines imposed on them for violating their state's resolution. In the case of South Dakota, which is one of the ones I have here, there's a civil fine of $5,000 for violating the state resolution, going beyond the scope. Utah requires an immediate recall. Tennessee charges the commissioner with a Class E felony. Florida voids all of your votes at the convention, and you are required to forfeit your commission. With that, I'll jump to my third and close this out. One of the other common arguments that opponents use is that we don't know how the convention will be conducted, and there will be a runaway convention. The short answer to that is that's not true. A runaway convention is associated with constitutional conventions, not conventions a convention of states. Constitutional conventions that have open agendas for all topics to be considered. This is not what that is. This effort is led by state-appointed commissioners to work towards 3 potential proposed amendments as stated in their state resolutions, and that is it. In terms of conduct, I will ask this. Does this legislature not use Mason's Manual of Legislative Procedures? No. You don't? Do you use Robert's Rules of Order? Mason's Manual of Legislative Procedure is the most commonly used manual across this country for legislative procedures. Likewise, does this legislature not adopt rules at the beginning of a session? Likewise, a convention of states would be operating in very much the same exact fashion. They will follow Mason's Manual of Legislative Procedure. It's about 700 pages, rather interesting read. They will approve rules and do so as common to the legislative norms of legislatures across this entire country. The Convention of States will be watched carefully, I can assure you that, by opponents, to include the Congress, which by its very nature is an institutional rival to the Convention of States, just waiting for an opportunity to invalidate the convention over some type of procedural matter or otherwise exceeding the scope. So a question was brought up earlier, the 19 states that have already passed. I have the list here and I'll read them off. Arizona, Alaska, Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Indiana, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, Nebraska, North Dakota, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, West Virginia, and Wisconsin. And as I mentioned, there are 17 other states that have active legislation right now, and some of those include Hawaii, New York, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Kentucky, Illinois, Maryland, Minnesota, Washington, Kansas, and Rhode Island.